In 1787, the British Admiralty commissioned HMS Bounty for a botanical mission to collect breadfruit plants from Tahiti and transport them to the Caribbean as an affordable food source for enslaved people. Lieutenant William Bligh, a seasoned navigator who had previously served under Captain James Cook, was chosen to command the vessel. The Bounty had a crew of 46, including Bligh, his officers, and seamen. Unlike most Royal Navy ships on such missions, the Bounty sailed without a detachment of Royal Marines, a factor that would later influence the events that unfolded. The ship departed England in December 1787. After failing to round Cape Horn due to severe weather, Bligh rerouted the Bounty via the Cape of Good Hope, finally arriving in Tahiti in October 1788 after a taxing 10-month journey. When HMS Bounty anchored in Matavai Bay, Tahiti on October 26, 1788, the crew was exhausted from a taxing 10-month voyage that included a failed attempt to round Cape Horn and a lengthy detour via the Cape of Good Hope. The island's lush landscape and the warmth of its people made an immediate impression on the men, who were eager for rest from the rigors of life at sea. Captain Bligh quickly established diplomatic relations with Chief Taina, the island's leading figure. This relationship was instrumental in securing the cooperation needed for the mission. In exchange for the locals' assistance, Bligh offered iron tools, cloth, and firearms, making it clear that Britain's interests were botanical rather than territorial. The crew's primary task was to construct a secure nursery for the plants near Point Venus. Fletcher Christian, whom Bligh trusted as acting lieutenant, was put in charge of this shore party. The enclosure, which would eventually house over 1,000 saplings, required constant attention and security. The work, though demanding, was far less punishing than shipboard life, and the crew soon found themselves adapting to a more relaxed pace. The extended stay, which stretched to 5 months as the breadfruit matured, allowed the men to deeply immerse themselves in Tahitian society. This immersion saw many sailors form intimate relationships with local women, a practice that Bligh simply tolerated, at least initially, as he recognized its positive effect on morale. Fletcher Christian's relationship with Mauatua, a woman of high status, was particularly significant, and by the end of the stay, nearly half the crew had contracted venereal diseases as a result of their actions. The men also adopted local customs, donning tapa cloth garments, participating in feasts, and even acquiring tattoos. Some, like Midshipman Peter Haywood, became so integrated that they learned the Tahitian language and were given local nicknames. Economic exchange between the crew and the locals flourished during this period. Sailors traded iron nails, axes, and articles of clothing for fresh food, local artifacts, and personal favors. This informal barter system, while beneficial in the short term, undermined discipline as sailors became increasingly focused on their own interests rather than their duties. Bligh's logbooks reflect his growing frustration with both the Tahitians' persistent thievery and his own crew's negligence, as tools and supplies regularly went missing. Bligh's approach to leadership during the Tahiti sojourn was inconsistent. At first, he granted the crew considerable freedom, allowing them extended shore leave and even hosting local chiefs aboard the Bounty. However, as the mission dragged on and discipline eroded, Bligh's patience wore thin. By December 1788, he began to reassert authority through stricter measures, including floggings for relatively minor offenses. The punishments were not reserved for ordinary screw members alone. Officers and trusted men were also subject to public reprimand. Bligh's penchant for berating his officers in front of both crew and Tahitians was particularly damaging. Fletcher Christian, once among Bligh's most loyal subordinates, became the primary target of these outbursts. During a dispute over missing supplies, he accused Christian of cowardice and incompetence, further deepening the rift between them. The so-called coconut incident in March 1789 marked a turning point in the relationship between Bligh and his officers. When he discovered that a significant portion of his private stock of coconuts had been stolen, he assembled the crew and, without concrete evidence, accused Christian of theft. The confrontation was heated, with Bligh publicly shaming Christian and threatening him with starvation. In response, Bligh ordered a reduction in the crew's yam rations, punishing everyone for the perceived crime of a few. This collective punishment alienated even those who had remained loyal. Christian, already emotionally strained, confided to his friend George Stewart that Bligh's insults had become unbearable. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere aboard the Bounty grew increasingly tense. The crew began to divide into factions, those who remained loyal to Bligh, those who sympathized with Christian but hesitated to act, and a core group who began to actively consider mutiny. Earlier, in February 1789, 3 sailors, Charles Churchill, John Millward, and William Muspratt, had deserted, seeking refuge in the mountains of Tahiti. Although they were eventually captured and flogged, their actions were a clear sign of the deepening discontent. As the date of departure approached in April, the mood among the men was grim. Christian told Bligh that the crew would rather die than return to England, to which Bligh responded with characteristic severity. In the early hours of April 28, 1789, the HMS Bounty was sailing in the South Pacific, approximately 30 nautical miles south of the island of Tofua. The ship had left Tahiti just over 3 weeks prior, its hold filled with breadfruit plants intended for transplantation to the West Indies. The atmosphere aboard had grown increasingly tense since departure, with relationships between Bligh and his officers having deteriorated significantly. At about 5:15 a.m., Christian, accompanied by the master-at-arms, the gunner's mate, and seaman Thomas Burkett, made his way to Bligh's cabin. Bligh was still asleep, dressed only in his nightshirt and naked from the waist down. The mutineers burst in, seized him, and tied his hands behind his back with a cord, threatening him with instant death if he made any noise or resisted. Despite the threats, Bligh managed to shout loudly enough to rouse the ship's officers and other crew members, creating a commotion that quickly spread throughout the vessel. The sudden violence and confusion awakened John Fryer, the ship's master, whose cabin was opposite Bligh's. Fryer, armed with pistols, considered intervening but was quickly ordered by the mutineers to remain in his cabin under threat of death. Armed guards were posted at each hatchway, ensuring that no one could mount a resistance. As Bligh was frog-marched out of his cabin and onto the quarterdeck, Christian, brandishing a bayonet, held the cord that bound Bligh's hands. According to some accounts, Christian wore a sounding plummet around his neck, intending to use it to drown himself if the mutiny failed. The deck of the Bounty was soon filled with noise and confusion. Some men cursed, others jeered, and many simply shouted in fear or for reassurance. It was not immediately clear who was actively participating in the mutiny, who was passively acquiescing, and who was simply caught up in the chaos. Bligh called out to his men by name, urging them to, quote, knock Christian down, and attempting to rally loyalists to his side. Fryer was briefly allowed on deck to speak to Christian, but his denunciations were so bitter that he was quickly forced below at bayonet point. Christian reportedly told Fryer, "I have been in hell for weeks past. Captain Bligh has brought this on himself." As the mutiny unfolded, some men, like Joseph Coleman and Thomas McIntosh, were observed crying or repeatedly declaring that they had no hand in the mutiny, while others, such as Peter Heywood, were believed to have been detained against their will. The initial plan had been to set Bligh and a handful of loyalists adrift in one of the ship's smaller boats. However, as more loyalists made it known that they would not remain aboard the mutinous vessel, it became apparent that a larger boat would be needed. The mutineers lowered the Bounty's 23-foot launch, a boat already small for the open ocean but the largest available, over the side. Bligh, his hands still bound, was forced into the launch, along with his clerk John Samuel and a growing number of loyalists. The final group included the friar, the boatswain William Cole, the carpenter William Purcell, the surgeon's mate Thomas Ledward, the botanist David Nelson, Bligh's servant, and several able seamen and marines, totaling 19 men. The launch was dangerously overcrowded, designed for a much smaller complement. The mutineers tossed in a meager supply of food and water, about 28 gallons of water and 150 pounds of bread, along with a few pieces of pork, wine, and rum. The loyalists were also given a quadrant, a compass, and a pocket watch, but no charts or navigational aids. The mutineers taunted Bligh and his men as they prepared to cast them adrift, some jeering and others simply watching in silence. At about 10 a.m., the launch was cut loose, and Bligh and his 18 loyal followers were left to the mercy of the Pacific. With Bligh and his loyalists gone, Christian and the mutineers found themselves in command of the Bounty, but with no clear plan for the future. The ship was now a floating paradox, a Royal Navy vessel under the control of rebels, adrift in the vast Pacific with the British Empire certain to pursue them. The mutineers' immediate concern was to avoid detection and prevent any further descent or desertion. Some advocated returning to Tahiti where they had friends and lovers, while others, fearing British retribution, urged seeking a more remote refuge. Christian's authority, though established by force, was far from secure, and the group's unity would soon be tested by the challenges ahead. Many of the crew, both loyalists and mutineers, wept openly, aware that their lives had changed irrevocably. It can't be emphasized enough just how small the launch was that Bligh had to share with his crewmen. The freeboard was only about 7 inches, so even a small wave threatened to swamp the boat. The men's possessions and any unnecessary items were thrown overboard to make room for the crew and the precious stores of resources. Bligh set a course for Tofua, an island about 30 miles away, hoping to find fresh water and additional food. Upon landing, the men found a cave in the cliffs for shelter and sent out parties to gather supplies. However, he made the mistake of telling the local islanders that they had been shipwrecked, which made the islanders realize the group was defenseless. Hostility grew, and on May 2nd, the islanders attacked. Quartermaster John Norton was killed as he tried to free the boat from the shore, but the rest escaped by throwing out clothing to distract their pursuers. After the attack on Tofua, Bligh realized that seeking help from other islands would be too dangerous. He decided their only hope was to sail directly to Timor, a Dutch outpost over 3,600 nautical miles away. This decision was both desperate and audacious, as it meant crossing some of the world's most treacherous open ocean in a tiny, overloaded boat with minimal supplies and no charts. However, Bligh's navigational skills were exceptional. With only a sextant, compass, and pocket watch, he kept meticulous logs and calculated their position daily. He rationed food and water with precision, reducing rations to as little as an ounce of bread and a quarter pint of water per man per day. When rain fell, the men collected every drop for drinking water. Bligh maintained strict discipline and routine, assigning duties, telling stories, and leading prayers to keep up morale. The men faced constant exposure to sun, wind, and salt water, which caused their clothes to rot and their skin to break out in painful infected sores. They were always wet, suffering from chills at night and blistering heat by day. Storms and high seas threatened to swamp the boat, and the men were forced to bail water constantly. Hunger and thirst were constant issues, and the men's bodies wasted away. Despite having a fishing line out at all times, they caught no fish. Occasionally, they managed to catch birds or gather rainwater, but these moments of relief were rare. The men grew increasingly weak, and it was only Bligh's careful rationing and encouragement that kept them going. After leaving Tofua, Bligh initially considered stopping at Tongatapu, where he knew the local king from an earlier voyage. However, the risk of another hostile encounter was too great. Instead, the launch sailed westward, passing through the Fijian Islands, but dared not stop due to the islanders' reputation for cannibalism. On May 28th, after a month at sea, the men sighted the Great Barrier Reef. Bligh found a navigable gap and steered the launch into a calm lagoon, landing on a small island off the coast of Northeast Australia, which he named Restoration Island. Here, the men found oysters and berries and were able to eat their fill for the first time in weeks. They spent 4 days island hopping northward within the lagoon, wary of the Aboriginal people they saw on the mainland. The strain of the journey began to show. On one islet, later named Sunday Island, a heated argument broke out between Bligh and the carpenter, William Purcell, over gathering clams. Bligh grabbed a cutlass and challenged Purcell to a fight, but the conflict was diffused when the bosun intervened. Despite these tensions, Bligh managed to maintain unity. After clearing Cape York, the northernmost point of Australia, on June 2nd, Bligh steered through a maze of shoals, reefs, and islands, eventually reaching the open Arafura Sea. This final leg was the most grueling, with the men on the brink of collapse from hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. By June 11th, many were close to death. On June 12th, the coast of Timor was sighted. Bligh wrote, "It is not possible for me to describe the pleasure which the blessing of the sight of this land diffused among us." 2 days later, on June 14th, 1789, the launch sailed into Kupang Harbor, where the Dutch authorities were astonished by their survival. Of the original 19 men, all but one, John Norton, who was killed on Taufua, had survived the 47-day, 3,618 nautical mile journey. As for those who remained on the Bounty, their fates weren't as great. The crew split into sharply divergent paths. After the mutiny, the group of men who remained in Tahiti faced a mixture of relief, internal conflict, and ultimately British law. Some, like Peter Heywood and James Morrison, attempted to assimilate into Tahitian society. Heywood learned the local language and customs, while Morrison led the construction of a schooner, the Resolution, in hopes of reaching the Dutch East Indies to clear his name. However, not all found peace. Charles Churchill and Matthew Thompson, for example, descended into lawlessness, their time on the island ending in murder. Churchill was killed by Thompson in a drunken fight, and Thompson was in turn killed by Churchill's Tahitian allies. The arrival of HMS Pandora in March 1791 marked a turning point for the Tahiti mutineers. Captain Edward Edwards apprehended 14 of them, confining them in a cramped cell on the quarterdeck, grimly dubbed Pandora's Box. The conditions were harsh. The men were chained, exposed to the tropical sun, and given meager rations. Among the prisoners were not only mutineers, but also a few loyalists who had been unable to leave the Bounty during the mutiny. When Pandora departed Tahiti in May 1791, she searched in vain for Christian's group before heading for home. Disaster struck on August 29th of the same year, when Pandora ran aground on the Great Barrier Reef. As the ship began to sink, Edwards hesitated to release the prisoners, and only after desperate pleas were the surviving mutineers freed from their cells. 4 prisoners drowned, but 10 survived, and along with 89 crew members endured a 1,000-mile open boat journey to Timor. Upon their return to England, the surviving mutineers faced court-martial aboard HMS Duke in June 1792. The proceedings were complex, with some like Joseph Coleman, Charles Norman, Thomas McIntosh, and Michael Byrne acquitted thanks to Bligh's testimony that they had remained loyal. Peter Heywood and James Morrison received royal pardons. However, Thomas Burkitt, John Millward, and Thomas Ellison were found guilty and hanged at Portsmouth on October 29, 1792. William Muspratt narrowly escaped execution due to a legal technicality. Meanwhile, Fletcher Christian and 8 of his fellow mutineers, accompanied by a group of Tahitian men and women, set sail from Tahiti in September 1789 in search of a safe haven. After months of searching, they discovered the remote and uninhabited Pitcairn Island in January 1790. To avoid detection, they burned the Bounty shortly after arrival. At first, the settlement was peaceful, but tension soon erupted. The European mutineers treated the Tahitian women as property, which bred resentment among the Tahitian men. In September 1793, violence exploded. The Tahitian men killed 5 mutineers, including Christian, who was shot while working in his garden. In retaliation, the surviving mutineers and women killed the remaining Tahitian men, leaving only 4 mutineers: Edward Young, William McCoy, Matthew Quintal, and John Adams by 1794. The years that followed contained further tragedy. McCoy began distilling alcohol from local plants, leading to widespread drunkenness and violence. Quintal, increasingly unstable, threatened the community and was ultimately killed by Adams and Young. McCoy later took his own life. With only Adams and Young left, the 2 men turned to the Bounty's Bible for guidance. Young taught Adams to read, and together they established a Christian community, promoting education and banning alcohol. After Young's death from asthma in 1800, Adams became the sole surviving mutineer and the patriarch of the island's growing population of women and children. When the American whaler Topaz rediscovered Pitcairn in 1808, they found a thriving, peaceful community led by Adams. He was later granted amnesty by the British and died in 1829, his grave still a landmark on the island. The descendants of the Bounty mutineers and their Tahitian companions remain on Pitcairn to this day, their society shaped by the extraordinary transformation that followed the violence of their early years. The cocoliztli epidemic, also known as the Great Pestilence, stands as one of the most devastating disease outbreaks in human history. Occurring in 16th century Mexico, then known as New Spain, this epidemic decimated indigenous populations on a massive scale. The term cocoliztli is derived from the Nahuatl language, meaning pestilence, and it aptly describes the catastrophic impact the disease had on the region. The clinical presentation of cocoliztli was marked by its rapid onset and extraordinary lethality. Historical accounts describe the initial symptoms as including high fever, severe headache, vertigo, and a blackened tongue. As the disease progressed, victims experienced dark urine, dysentery, intense abdominal and thoracic pain, large nodules behind the ears, and acute neurological disturbances such as hallucinations and convulsions. Jaundice and profuse bleeding from the nose, eyes, mouth, and private areas were also common. The progression from initial symptoms to death was alarmingly swift, with many individuals dying within 3 to 7 days. Francisco Hernandez, a royal physician who witnessed the 1576 outbreak, meticulously documented these symptoms, emphasizing their distinctness from other known diseases of the era such as measles, typhus, or yellow fever. The initial outbreak, spanning from 1545 to 1548, claimed between 5 and 15 million lives, eradicating as much as 80% of the indigenous population in the highland regions. The devastation was so thorough that entire communities vanished almost overnight. In the Valley of Mexico, for example, the death toll soared to 800,000, resulting in the abandonment of numerous settlements. The scale of mortality far surpassed even that of the European Black Death, as Mexico's estimated pre-Hispanic population of 25 million in 1519 plummeted to a mere 1 million by the year 1600. The speed and horror of the deaths were noted by contemporary chroniclers who described bodies accumulating faster than they could be buried. Priests and local officials labored from dawn until dusk to dispose of the dead in mass graves, often foregoing any traditional funeral rites due to the overwhelming numbers. The social fabric of local communities unraveled rapidly under the weight of such loss. Survivors were left to grapple with the collapse of families, the orphaning of children, and the dissolution of various networks. The labor systems imposed by the Spanish, particularly the encomienda, which forced indigenous people into near slavery, also collapsed as the workforce was decimated. Those who remained were often poorly fed, inadequately clothed, and severely overworked, leaving them even more susceptible to disease. By 1549, the acute shortage of labor forced the Spanish crown to replace the encomienda with the repartimiento system, which centralized labor control but continued to impose harsh conditions. The demographic collapse also created power vacuums and opportunities for Spanish colonists to seize abandoned indigenous lands, accelerating the concentration of wealth and property. Many non-encomendero settlers took advantage of the chaos to claim territories, while surviving indigenous groups were forcibly relocated into reducciones, or congregations, for easier control and Christianization. As mentioned, the cause of the epidemics has been a subject of intense debate for centuries, with no single explanation universally accepted by historians, epidemiologists, or geneticists. The mystery is compounded by the epidemic's catastrophic death toll, its rapid and devastating spread, and the unique constellation of symptoms described in historical sources. Two main hypotheses dominate contemporary discussion. One posits a viral hemorrhagic fever, likely indigenous to the Americas, while the other points to a bacterial cause, specifically Salmonella enterica paratyphi C, possibly introduced from Europe. Both theories draw from a wealth of historical, archaeological, genetic, and climatological evidence, and each presents compelling arguments and notable limitations. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn arose in late Victorian England, a period marked by a renewed fascination with secret societies, ritual magic, and the occult. Its inception was the result of a complex mix between personal ambition, scholarly curiosity, and a desire to create a systematized approach to Western esotericism. The principal architect of the order was William Wynne Westcott, a London coroner and respected occultist with deep roots in the Masonic and Rosicrucian communities. In February 1886, Westcott came into possession of a set of mysterious encrypted documents known as the cipher manuscripts. These manuscripts, which he received from Reverend Adolphus Frederick Alexander Woodford, a fellow Mason and antiquarian, were written in English but encoded using the Trithemius cipher, a cryptographic method dating to the Renaissance. Over the course of 1887, Westcott decoded the manuscripts. The contents revealed a detailed initiatory system based on hermetic Kabbalah, astrology, geomancy, and alchemical symbolism. The manuscripts outlined a series of ritual grades, provided magical diagrams, included sketches of tarot cards, and described the structure for a new order. Recognizing the potential significance of these materials, Westcott sought the collaboration of two trusted colleagues from the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers and Dr. William Robert Woodman. Mathers, already recognized for his expertise in ceremonial magic and his scholarly work on the Kabbalah, played a crucial role in expanding and refining the rituals, particularly those for the higher or second order grades. Woodman, a physician and former supreme magus of the SRIA, contributed his extensive knowledge of Kabbalistic and Rosicrucian traditions, though his involvement would be cut short by his death in 1891. To provide an air of legitimacy, Westcott claimed to have established a correspondence with a German Rosicrucian adept, Anna Sprengel, supposedly a countess residing in Nuremberg. According to Westcott, Sprengel was the daughter of King Ludwig I of Bavaria and the famous courtesan Lola Montez. Through letters, Sprengel allegedly authorized Westcott to form an English branch of the Continental Rosicrucian Order. While this story lent the Golden Dawn an aura of continental pedigree, later investigations by historians and even by some members of the order itself revealed that Sprengel almost certainly never existed. The letters were likely fabricated by Westcott, a move that, while controversial, was not uncommon among secret societies seeking to establish mythic origins. The origins of the cipher manuscripts themselves remain a subject of debate among scholars. One theory holds that they were created by Kenneth Mackenzie, a Rosicrucian scholar whose papers were inherited by Woodford. Another posits that Westcott and Mathers themselves composed the manuscripts, drawing inspiration from earlier occult works such as Francis Barrett's The Magus. A third theory suggests the manuscripts derive from the German Gold- und Rosenkreuz order, with which Mackenzie may have had some association. Regardless of their true origin, the manuscripts provided the scaffolding for the Golden Dawn's elaborate system of grades, rituals, and teachings. From its inception, the Golden Dawn distinguished itself from other secret societies in several key ways. Most notably, it admitted women on equal terms with men, a radical innovation in the context of Victorian England. Early female initiates such as Moina Mathers and Florence Farr would go on to play leading roles in the order's development. The rituals themselves, while borrowing certain structural elements from Freemasonry and the SRIA, emphasize personal spiritual transformation and practical magical work rather than mere fraternal bonding or social advancement. Despite its early successes, the Golden Dawn was plagued by internal strife and power struggles. Samuel Mathers' increasingly autocratic leadership and his insistence on absolute loyalty alienated many members. In 1900, a major revolt erupted in the London temples after members uncovered evidence of Mathers' fabrications, including forged letters from Anna Sprengel. This crisis led to the order's fragmentation into several competing factions. By 1903, the original Golden Dawn had effectively dissolved, but its offshoots continued its teachings. Born on November 1, 1896 in Yucatan, Wenceslao Moguel Herrera grew up during a time where Mexico was being torn apart by factional violence, shifting alliances, and the collapse of old power structures. By early 1915, the revolution had entered one of its bloodiest phases, with the forces of Pancho Villa, known as Villistas, facing relentless opposition from the constitutionalists, commonly referred to as the Federales, who sought to consolidate control under the leadership of Venustiano Carranza. At the age of 25, Moguel had joined a band of irregular fighters aligned with Pancho Villa. These groups were often poorly armed and lacked formal military training, making them vulnerable to the better equipped and more organized federales. On March 18, 1915, Moguel's unit was operating near the town of Jalaco, a small settlement in Yucatan. The region had seen significant fighting, and the federales were actively hunting down suspected villistas determined to stamp out any lingering opposition. On that fateful day, Moguel's group was quickly overwhelmed by a superior federales force led by Colonel Ortiz. The engagement was brief and decisive. The villista unit, outgunned and inexperienced, stood little chance against the government troops. Moguel, along with several comrades, was captured outside Jalaco. The federales did not see the need for trials or investigations. The mere association with Villa's forces was enough to seal their fate. Upon capture, Moguel and his fellow prisoners were taken to the outskirts of Jalaco. The location was chosen for its isolation, ensuring that the executions could be carried out without interference and that the bodies could be disposed of discreetly. The prisoners were lined up against the wall of a local church before being offered a final cigarette. Moguel, facing imminent death, accepted the cigarette, smoked it, and was then blindfolded. The soldiers readied their rifles, and the prisoners braced themselves for the end. Once the order was given, a firing squad of 8 men took aim at Moguel and the others. The volley of shots rang out, striking Moguel multiple times in the torso and limbs. The force of the bullets knocked him to the ground, and he lay among the bodies of his comrades, most of whom died instantly. However, despite being hit by as many as 8 or 9 bullets, Moguel remained conscious, his vital organs miraculously spared. Colonel Ortiz approached the fallen Moguel to administer a final shot intended to ensure death and prevent any possibility of survival. He pressed his revolver against Moguel's head and fired. The bullet entered Moguel's right cheek and exited below his left eye, somehow missing his brain and major arteries. Despite the excruciating pain and severe injury, Moguel did not die. For hours, Moguel lay motionless, feigning death to avoid detection by any lingering soldiers. As night descended, he summoned the strength to crawl away from the execution site. His destination was the Church of St. James Apostle, located roughly 3 blocks away. The journey was agonizing. His face was shattered, his jaw broken, and his body riddled with bullet wounds, yet he managed to drag himself through the darkness, leaving a trail of blood behind. The cold night air may have slowed his bleeding, and adrenaline likely kept him conscious during this harrowing ordeal. Accounts of what happened next vary. According to the most widely cited version, Moguel reached the church by dawn and collapsed at its entrance. He was discovered by a parishioner who quickly alerted the local priest. Recognizing the severity of his injuries and the risk of further violence if the federales discovered him alive, the priest and a local textile merchant named Eduardo Mendez took Moguel into the church's sacristy. There, they cleaned his wounds with alcohol and herbal poultices, stabilized his broken jaw with cloth bandages, and did their best to stave off infection. Mendez, aware that aiding a suspected rebel could mean death, nevertheless concealed Moguel in the church for months, risking his own life to save another. An alternative account suggests that the following morning, federales returned to the execution site to bury the bodies and discovered that Moguel was still alive. In this version, a junior officer named Lieutenant Ramirez, possibly moved by guilt or religious conviction, intervened and had Moguel transported to a field hospital. There, an army medic named Dr. Alvaro Castillo provided emergency care, extracting bullets, suturing wounds, and administering morphine for pain. Despite the differences in these accounts, it did not change the fact that the injuries were severe. His facial injuries were permanent. His right cheek had collapsed, his maxillary bone was exposed, and he suffered partial paralysis of his left eyelid. The recovery was long and grueling, taking over a year and a half. During the initial weeks, he was immobilized and required daily care to change dressings, drain pus, and debride dead tissue. He was unable to speak for 6 months and could only consume liquids due to the instability of his jaw. By late 1916, he managed to walk with a cane, though he continued to suffer from chronic pain and facial paralysis for the rest of his life. To avoid further danger, Moguel remained hidden in the church sacristy for 8 months, with Mendez smuggling him food and supplies. The local priest, Father Ignacio Garcia, even falsified burial records to list Moguel as deceased, thereby protecting him from further pursuit by the authorities. When the violence in the region subsided in 1916, Moguel moved to Merida under the alias Lázaro Campos, taking up work as a night laborer and keeping his survival a secret. His ordeal became a local legend, but he avoided any publicity until he emigrated to the United States in 1930. He settled in Texas, where he joined a growing community of Mexican immigrants. Initially, he was virtually unknown in his new country. His disfigured face, however, drew attention and curiosity from locals. When asked about his injuries, Moguel began to share his incredible story of survival. Word of his ordeal spread, and he gradually became a figure of fascination within the community. His story eventually reached the ears of Robert Ripley, the famed American cartoonist, radio host, and creator of Ripley's Believe It or Not. Ripley was always on the lookout for stories of the bizarre and extraordinary. On July 16, 1937, he was invited to appear on Ripley's national radio show in Cleveland, Ohio. The broadcast introduced him to a wide American audience, and he was quickly rebranded as El Fusilado, the Executed One. The show's listeners were captivated by the account of a man who had survived a firing squad and a point-blank shot to the head, emerging alive and able to recount his experience. Ripley's team promoted Moguel as a living marvel, and his fame soared. Following his radio appearance, Moguel embarked on a tour of the United States, sponsored by NBC and Ripley's organization. During these tours, he would recount his story to live audiences, sometimes displaying his scars and recounting the details of his ordeal. He became a minor celebrity, attracting the attention of journalists, producers, and the public. His story was featured in Ripley's syndicated newspaper column and comic strips, further cementing his reputation as one of the world's most improbable survivors. As the years passed and the world's attention shifted to new events, particularly the approach of World War II, Moguel's fame gradually faded in the United States. He eventually returned to Mexico, settling once again in Yucatan, where he lived out his remaining years. Despite the decline in his public profile, he remained a figure of local renown and a source of inspiration for many. Moguel lived a long life, passing away on July 29, 1976, at the age of 85. He was buried in his beloved Yucatan, having outlived not only the revolution that nearly claimed his life, but also many of the men who had condemned him to death. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum theft is one of the most infamous and perplexing art crimes in history. In the early hours of March 18, 1990, two men disguised as Boston police officers arrived at the museum's side entrance. Claiming to be responding to a disturbance call, they convinced night guard Richard A. Bath to admit them, a clear violation of security protocol. Once inside, the imposters quickly subdued Richard and his colleague Randy Hestand, handcuffing and securing them in the museum's basement. This act effectively neutralized the only on-site security personnel, leaving the museum's priceless collection vulnerable. Over the next 81 minutes, the thieves moved methodically through the museum's galleries. Their movements were tracked only by motion detectors, as the museum lacked interior surveillance cameras at the time. The thieves targeted three main areas. In the Dutch room, they used blades to cut Rembrandt's Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee and A Lady and Gentleman in Black from their frames, inflicting irreversible damage. They also removed Vermeer's The Concert and Flink's Landscape with an obelisk with somewhat more care, and took a rare Shang Dynasty Chinese bronze gyue from a table. Additionally, a small Rembrandt etching vanished from this gallery. In the short gallery, the thieves spent a surprising 25 minutes attempting to unscrew a Napoleonic flagpole before abandoning the effort and settling for its eagle finial. They also removed 5 Degas sketches from the same room. In the blue room, Edouard Manet's Chez Tortoni was stolen, though curiously, motion detectors registered no activity in this area during the theft. After making 2 trips to their vehicle to transport the stolen items, the thieves departed at 2:45 a.m. Before leaving, they collected security footage and motion detector printouts from the director's office, but overlooked a hard drive containing crucial data. The guards remained bound until discovered by day shift staff at 8:15 a.m. The selection of stolen items has long puzzled experts and investigators. While the thieves took some of the museum's most valuable works, they also took less significant objects. These items were of relatively minor value compared to other masterpieces left untouched, such as Titian's The Rape of Europa and a Michelangelo drawing. The thieves also ignored Rembrandt's large self-portrait on wood, further confounding those who have tried to piece together their motives. Security failures played a critical role in the heist's success. Richard's decision to open the employee entrance without authorization some 90 minutes before the theft may have enabled the thieves to conduct reconnaissance or prepare for their crime. He also left the watch desk at the thieves' request, allowing them to control the security hub of the museum. The absence of interior cameras, the lack of armed or highly trained guards, and the minimal response protocols all contributed to the museum's vulnerability. These lapses, combined with Richard's inconsistent statements about alarm deactivation and his unexplained actions, have fueled persistent theories that the theft may have involved inside assistance or collusion. Theories about the perpetrators and their motives have evolved over the years. The FBI's leading hypothesis has long centered on Boston's organized crime networks. One possibility is that the artworks were stolen as collateral for legal negotiations or as bargaining chips within criminal enterprises. Notably, Bobby Donati, a known associate of the Patriarca crime family, allegedly offered to return the stolen art in 1994 to secure a reduced sentence for an imprisoned capo, but he was murdered before any exchange could occur. Other suspects, including George Reisfelder and Leonard DiMuzio, were linked to the Dorchester gang and reportedly transported the art to Philadelphia and Connecticut, but both died within a year of the heist, leaving investigators with few leads. Alternative theories also ran rampant. Some experts believe the thieves were amateurs, as indicated by their haphazard selection and the damage inflicted on several works. The inclusion of certain items may have been the result of ignorance or confusion, suggesting the thieves did not fully understand the value or significance of what they were taking. Another theory posits that a private collector commissioned the theft, targeting specific pieces such as the Vermeer, although no credible evidence has ever surfaced to support this claim. There is also speculation that the heist may have served as a distraction for other criminal activities, using the high-profile nature of the museum's loss to divert law enforcement attention. In the days following the theft, the museum offered a $1 million reward for information leading to the recovery of the artworks. The FBI and museum officials interviewed staff, reviewed security protocols, and canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses. 4 people leaving a nearby St. Patrick's Day party reported seeing 2 men in police uniforms sitting in a car outside the museum shortly after midnight, corroborating the timeline of the thieves' arrival. In April 1994, the museum received a letter from an anonymous writer claiming to be able to facilitate the return of the paintings in exchange for over $2.5 million and immunity for the thieves and those holding the paintings. The museum turned the letter over to the FBI, but the communication ceased and the offer was never substantiated. The museum increased its reward and continued to publicize the case, hoping to generate new leads. The empty frames of the stolen works were left hanging in the galleries as placeholders and reminders of the loss, a decision made in 1994 to keep public attention on the missing masterpieces and to encourage their eventual return. As the years passed, the case remained unsolved, but the investigation did not stop. The FBI's Boston field office, in partnership with the museum and the U.S. Attorney's Office, continued to follow leads around the world. Special Agent Jeff Kelly, who inherited the case in 2002, spent years tracking tips, interviewing suspects, and coordinating with international law enforcement agencies. Despite the global search, none of the stolen works were recovered and no arrests were made. Around 2010, the museum significantly increased its reward, offering $10 million for information leading to the recovery of the stolen art, the largest private reward ever offered for such a case. The FBI continued to receive and investigate tips, some of which suggested that the paintings might still be in the United States, possibly in the Boston area or nearby states. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, sometimes referred to as TALA, was made out of a sweeping mid-19th century movement to reform mental health care in the United States. In the early 1850s, the Virginia General Assembly authorized the creation of a new, modern facility that would incorporate the latest thinking in humane treatment for the mentally ill. This initiative was heavily influenced by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, a pioneering psychiatrist and superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. Kirkbride's philosophy centered on the belief that environment played a crucial role in healing, and he advocated for asylums designed to maximize sunlight, fresh air, and tranquility. The so-called Kirkbride Plan became the blueprint for the new institution, with the aim of providing a therapeutic setting that contrasted sharply with the overcrowded and often inhumane conditions found in jails and poorhouses of the era. Construction began in late 1858, utilizing both prison labor and skilled stonemasons from Germany and Ireland. However, the construction process was dramatically disrupted by the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. Confederate forces seized control of the unfinished asylum, and Union troops under Colonel Erastus Bernard Tyler of the 7th Ohio Volunteer Infantry intercepted $30,000 worth of gold that had been allocated for the project. This money was diverted to support the pro-Union restored government of Virginia in Wheeling. The site itself became a pawn in the conflict, suffering from looting, material shortages, and repeated changes of control. Construction materials were stolen by Confederate raiders, and the partially built structure sustained damage during the war's tumultuous years. Work on the asylum resumed in 1862 when the restored government returned the previously diverted funds. Under Union supervision, construction slowly advanced, and the first patients were admitted in October 1864, even though the building was far from complete. It took until 1881 for the main structure to finish. This marked the end of a 23-year construction saga that had been repeatedly interrupted by war, financial crises, and logistical challenges. In its early years, the asylum's patient population grew steadily. However, as the 19th century progressed, the reasons for admission expanded dramatically. Patients were committed for a bewildering range of conditions, some medical, some social, and some little more than quirks or family disputes. Reasons included not only mental illnesses such as mania or melancholia, but also epilepsy, asthma, menopause, laziness, domestic troubles, and even egotism and greediness. This broad interpretation of mental illness, coupled with the lack of alternative care facilities, led to a surge in admissions. By 1880, the asylum was already housing 717 patients, nearly 3 times its intended capacity. The staff struggled to provide even basic care, and the institution's resources were stretched thin. The facility's own farm, dairy, and waterworks, intended to support a modest population, could not keep up with the growing demands. By 1938, the population had reached over 1,600. By 1949, it was over 1,800, and by 1950, the asylum peaked at an astonishing 2,500 patients. This meant that the building, designed for 250, was holding nearly 10 times that number. Patients were crammed into every available space, with beds lining hallways and communal areas. This extreme overcrowding had devastating effects on living conditions. Sanitation deteriorated, with inadequate plumbing and waste removal leading to foul odors and the spread of disease. Heating and lighting were unreliable, and infestations of vermin were common. As the asylum's population ballooned, staffing levels failed to keep pace. Underfunded and overworked, the staff resorted to increasingly harsh and custodial measures. Many patients who became agitated or violent were simply locked away, some even chained to walls or confined in isolation cells for extended periods. The asylum became notorious for its use of lobotomies, particularly after Dr. Walter Freeman's West Virginia lobotomy project. Freeman, a leading proponent of the ice-pick lobotomy, performed thousands of procedures at the asylum. While intended to cure mental illness, these procedures often left patients with severe brain damage, personality changes, or even death. In total, the hospital performed over 4,000 lobotomies, more than any other facility in the region. Other treatments included electroconvulsive therapy, insulin shock therapy, and the use of early antipsychotic drugs such as thorazine. These interventions were often administered not with therapeutic intent, but as a means of controlling behavior and reducing the burden on staff. By the 1970s, the asylum's decline had become impossible to ignore. The physical plant was crumbling, with leaks, mold, and structural failures becoming common. Funding for mental health care shifted nationwide, with new medications and outpatient treatments offering alternatives to long-term institutionalization. The opening of new facilities led to a gradual reduction in the patient population, but the most untreatable or violent individuals were often left behind at the asylum. In the 1980s, the asylum's function shifted further from treatment to containment. The facility began to resemble a prison more than a hospital, with some patients locked away for years or even decades. The sense of hopelessness was palpable. One man who had lived at the asylum for 60 years reportedly wept when told he would be relocated. He died just weeks after leaving the only home he had ever known. By 1994, the asylum was forced to shut down. The suffering and deaths of thousands of patients over more than a century have contributed to widespread reports of paranormal activity. Visitors, staff, and investigators have described a wide array of supernatural phenomena, including apparitions, shadowy figures, disembodied voices, unexplained cold spots, and the sensation of being watched or touched by unseen forces. Among the most famous spirits said to haunt the asylum is Lily, a young girl believed to have died of pneumonia. Her presence is often felt in room 323, where visitors leave toys and candy that are reportedly moved or played with by invisible hands. Another well-known ghost is Dean, a patient who was murdered by fellow inmates. His spirit is said to linger in the room where he died, sometimes accompanied by the presence of his killers. Ruth, a former patient known for her hostility toward men, is said to throw objects at male visitors, while the menacing entity known as Slewfoot is associated with violence and is believed to haunt the upper floors and bathrooms. Today, the building has become a major destination for ghost hunters and tourists alike. The asylum offers a variety of tours, including daytime history tours, nighttime ghost tours, and overnight paranormal investigations, all of which attract visitors from across the country and around the world. Rapsittie Street Kids Believe in Santa is a 2002 American animated musical Christmas special that has become infamous for its unusual animation, troubled production, and eventual cult status. The special was produced by Wolf Tracer Studios and J. Rose Productions, with Colin Slater and Chris Rose at the helm. Production began with a reported budget of around $650,000. Wolf Tracer Studios, which had previously produced the obscure direct-to-video film Wolf Tracer's Dinosaur Island, was responsible for the animation. A significant issue in the production was the lack of oversight. Chris Rose, one of the producers, trusted the animation team to deliver a quality product and did not monitor their progress. As a result, he only saw the finished special during its television premiere, by which time it was too late to make changes. Early promotional materials referred to the project as the Bash Street Kids, but the name was changed to avoid confusion with a British comic strip. The special ultimately aired in December 2002. The story centers on Ricky Rogers, a poor kid who lives with his great-grandmother Fran after the death of his mother. As Christmas approaches, Ricky decides to give his most cherished possession, a teddy bear his mother gave him, to Nicole, a wealthy and self-absorbed classmate, during a class gift exchange. Nicole dismisses the bear as cheap and throws it away, leaving Ricky heartbroken. After being teased for writing a letter to Santa, Ricky tries to mail it, but the wind blows the letter to Nicole's house. She reads the letter and discovers that Ricky's Christmas wish is not only for a video game console for himself, but also for gifts for all his classmates, including Nicole. The letter also reveals the deep sentimental value of the teddy bear. Feeling guilty, Nicole, her friend Leanie, and Ricky's friend Smithy set out to retrieve the bear from the local dump, facing various obstacles such as guard dogs and bullies. They eventually recover the bear and return it to Ricky, who reiterates the importance of friendship over material gifts. A secondary plot involves Lani, who loses her belief in Santa after being mocked by her peers. Her father helps restore her faith, which inspires Nicole and the others to believe as well. The special concludes with the group celebrating Christmas together and catching a glimpse of Santa's sleigh. Upon its release, the special was met with overwhelmingly negative reviews. Critics and viewers alike called out its poor animation, simplistic and heavy-handed plot, uninspired music, and editing errors, including visible spelling mistakes in background signage. Many viewers expressed disbelief that a product of such low quality could have aired on television, especially with such a notable cast. The special eventually gained a reputation as a cult oddity, much of which has been attributed to the strange and somewhat uncanny nature of the animation. The stone forest in Yunnan province, China, stands as one of the world's most captivating geological wonders. Spanning approximately 400 to 500 square kilometers, this site is renowned for its surreal landscape of towering limestone formations that resemble a petrified forest. The stone forest is not only a testament to the power of natural forces over millions of years, but also a cultural and spiritual landmark for the local people. The origins of the stone forest trace back to the Permian period, roughly 270 million years ago, when the region was submerged under a shallow sea. Over time, marine sediments accumulated and solidified into thick layers of limestone. As geological forces shifted, tectonic uplift gradually exposed these limestone deposits to the surface. Once exposed, the limestone was subjected to the relentless forces of nature, particularly the slightly acidic rainwater in the area. This rainwater seeped into the rock, exploiting natural fractures and dissolving the limestone along vertical cracks. Over millions of years, this process deepened the fissures and separated the rock into isolated stone pillars. Recent scientific experiments have shed new light on the formation of these sharp pinnacles. Researchers have used candy dissolution as a model to mimic the erosion of limestone, discovering that water flow patterns are key to the creation of the stone forest's distinctive shapes. Water flows more rapidly over the peaks, concentrating dissolution and sharpening the pinnacles, while slower flow in the valleys widens the gaps between them. Furthermore, the forest is steeped in folklore, with many of the stone formations believed to embody human and animal figures. The most famous of these is the Ashima stone, which is linked to a poignant local legend. According to Yi mythology, Ashima was a beautiful young woman who, after a tragic series of events, was transformed into stone. Her story is commemorated during the annual Torch Festival, when the Yi people gather in the forest to honor her spirit through song, dance, and ritual. Today, the stone forest attracts millions of visitors each year. However, the popularity of the site has brought significant conservation challenges. The sheer volume of foot traffic threatens to damage the fragile stone formations, while pollution from nearby urbanization poses risks to the region's groundwater quality. To address these challenges, authorities have implemented a range of conservation measures, including the establishment of restricted access zones on preservation initiatives.